Moscow, August 12, 1989. Francis Buchholz stood at the edge of Luzhniki Stadium's backstage area, watching 100,000 Russians lose their minds to Western rock music. The night air carried the scent of cigarettes, sweat, and something Francis had never smelled before, the electric anticipation of history being made. The Moscow Music Peace Festival was supposed to be about bringing East and West together through music, but what Francis witnessed that night would reveal a secret that had haunted one of metal's greatest legends for 7 years. The Scorpions had just finished their set to thunderous applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the Soviet Union. Klaus Meine's voice had soared over Wind of Change, and Francis's bass lines had provided the steady heartbeat beneath it all. Now, in the controlled chaos of backstage, roadies scrambled to clear equipment while bands prepared for their slots. The air buzzed with nervous energy. American and European rock stars performing for a communist audience that had been forbidden to hear this music for decades. Francis wiped the sweat from his forehead and leaned against a concrete wall, his precision bass still slung across his shoulder. The engineer in him was already analyzing the acoustics of the stadium, mentally noting how the sound had bounced off the massive concrete structure. But his contemplation was interrupted by a figure emerging from the shadows near the equipment trucks. Ozzy Osbourne, the Prince of Darkness himself, was walking directly toward him with an expression Francis had never seen before, vulnerability mixed with something that looked almost like fear. "Francis." Ozzy's voice was quieter than usual, his Birmingham accent thicker when he wasn't performing. "Can I talk to you for a minute, somewhere private?" There was something in Ozzy's eyes that made Francis straighten up. This wasn't the wild-eyed madman who bit heads off bats or the charismatic frontman who commanded stadiums. This was a man carrying a burden that was eating him alive from the inside. They walked away from the main backstage area, past the catering tents and production trailers, until they found a quiet spot near the stadium's outer wall. Moscow's skyline stretched before them, the lights of the city reflecting off the Moscow River in the distance. Ozzy pulled out a cigarette with hands that Francis noticed were trembling slightly. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant roar of the crowd as Bon Jovi took the stage. "You know," Ozzy finally said, exhaling smoke into the cool Russian night, "people think they know what happened to Randy." March 19, 1982. The plane crash in Florida. Tragic accident, young genius taken too soon. He took another deep drag, his eyes fixed on something in the distance that Francis couldn't see. But that's not the whole story. There's something I've never told anyone, something that's been eating me alive for 7 years. Francis remained silent, recognizing the weight of confession in Ozzy's voice. As the quiet architect of Scorpion's sound, Francis had learned that sometimes the most important thing you could do was simply listen. He leaned against the wall, his bass creating a comfortable barrier between himself and whatever truth Ozzy was about to reveal. "The night before Randy died," Ozzy continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, "we had a fight, a massive bloody row. He came to me with this classical piece he'd been working on, something beautiful and complex. He wanted to incorporate it into our next album, said it would elevate what we were doing, make it more sophisticated." Ozzy's laugh was bitter, hollow. "I told him no, said it was too pretentious, that our fans wanted to rock, not sit through some concert hall rubbish." The confession hung in the air like smoke. Francis could hear the pain in Ozzy's voice, 7 years of guilt compressed into words he'd apparently never spoken aloud. In the distance, Bon Jovi was tearing through Livin' on a Prayer, but the celebration felt a world away from this moment of raw honesty. "Randy looked at me like I'd slapped him," Ozzy continued, flicking ash from his cigarette with more violence than necessary. "He said, 'Ozzy, we could be more than just a rock band. We could create something that lasts, something that matters beyond just getting people drunk and loud.' And you know what I said to him? I said, 'Save the art school crap for someone who cares. I need you to make me sound like a rock star, not a bloody symphony conductor.'" Francis felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd worked with enough musicians to know the look Randy must have had, the expression of an artist whose vision had been dismissed by someone they trusted. It was the look Klaus got sometimes when commercial pressures tried to water down their sound, the look any creative person got when told their deepest inspiration wasn't good enough. The next morning, Ozzy's voice cracked slightly. Randy was so quiet during breakfast. Professional, polite, but distant. "When he got on that bloody plane to buzz the tour bus, I thought he was just showing off for the pilot's girlfriend. But now I think, Christ, Francis, I think he was angry, hurt. Maybe if I'd listened to him, encouraged his classical side instead of shutting it down, maybe he wouldn't have been in that headspace. Maybe he wouldn't have gotten on that plane." The weight of Ozzy's words settled over them like a heavy blanket. Francis understood guilt, every musician did. The what-ifs that haunted you after arguments with bandmates. the harsh words said in moments of stress that you could never take back. But this was different. This was 7 years of wondering if artistic rejection had contributed to the death of a genius. "Why are you telling me this?" Francis asked quietly, his German accent softening the English words. It was the first thing he'd said since Ozzy had started talking, and it seemed to surprise them both. Ozzy looked at him with eyes that held an ocean of regret. "Because I've been watching you tonight," Ozzy replied. "The way you support Klaus's vision, the way you listen when someone in your band has an idea. You're what I should have been to Randy. You're the foundation that lets everyone else soar." He took a final drag from his cigarette and threw it down, crushing it under his boot with unnecessary force. "And because in a few minutes I'm going to go out there and play Crazy Train for 100,000 Russians, and every note Randy wrote for that song is going to remind me of what we lost." Francis was quiet for a long moment, processing not just Ozzy's confession but the responsibility that came with hearing it. In his engineering mind, he was already analyzing the problem, looking for solutions, for some way to ease the burden Ozzy had been carrying. Finally, he spoke. "Randy knew you believed in him," Francis said simply. "Artists don't work with people they don't trust. He stayed with you because he saw something in your music together that was worth the frustration. One argument doesn't erase years of collaboration." Francis adjusted his bass strap, a gesture that had become automatic over 18 years with Scorpions. The classical piece he wanted to add. "Do you still have it?" Ozzy's eyes widened slightly.
"Yeah, I've got the demo tape locked in my safe at home. Haven't been able to listen to it since."
He trailed off, but Francis nodded understanding. "Then honor it," Francis said with quiet conviction. "Use it somehow, not because you owe Randy, but because good music shouldn't die with the musician. That's how we keep them alive, through the art they left behind." Francis paused, watching Ozzy's face in the dim light from the stadium. Guilt is just love with nowhere to go. Channel it into something Randy would have been proud of. Something shifted in Ozzy's expression. For the first time since their conversation began, Francis saw a flicker of hope replace the haunted look in his eyes. It was as if Francis had given him permission to transform his guilt into something productive rather than destructive. "You know," Ozzy said, his voice stronger now, "Sharon keeps telling me to find a way to honor Randy's memory beyond just dedicating songs to him. Maybe this is it. Maybe I can find a way to blend that classical piece into something new, something that shows the world the full range of what Randy could do." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Two musicians from different worlds united by the universal language of loss and creativity. In the distance, they could hear the crowd roaring approval for Bon Jovi's set. But here in their bubble of confession and understanding, the noise felt secondary to the healing that was taking place. "Francis," Ozzy said as they began walking back toward the backstage area, "thank you for listening without judging. Most people hear a story like that and immediately start offering solutions or telling me it wasn't my fault. You just listened. And somehow that made it easier to say what I needed to say." Francis smiled slightly, that rare public expression of emotion that his bandmates cherished when they saw it. "Sometimes the best thing you can do for someone's pain is witness it," he replied. "Engineers solve problems by understanding them completely first. Same principle applies to grief." As they approached the organized chaos of the production area, Francis noticed Ozzy's entire demeanor had changed. The weight he'd been carrying seemed lighter. Not gone, but somehow more manageable. They could hear the Scorpions crew beginning to pack up equipment while Motley Crue prepared for their slot. "One more thing," Ozzy said, stopping just before they rejoined the crowd of roadies and musicians. "Whatever you do with Scorpions, whatever creative directions Klaus or the others want to explore, support them. Don't let commercial pressure or label demands kill good ideas before they have a chance to breathe. Randy had so much more to give the world, and I silenced some of it out of fear." Francis nodded solemnly. "We call it the long view in our band," he said. "Individual songs matter, but the overall musical legacy matters more. Klaus has always understood that. So does Rudolph. We're not just making records, we're building something that will outlast all of us." The conversation stayed with Francis long after that night in Moscow. Watching Ozzy perform Crazy Train later in the evening, Francis heard new layers in Randy's guitar work, understood more deeply the collaborative magic that happens when musicians trust each other's artistic instincts. When Ozzy sang Randy's words, there was a reverence in his voice that spoke of healing beginning to replace guilt. 6 months later, Francis received a package at his home in Hanover. Inside was a demo tape with a note in Ozzy's distinctive handwriting. "Francis, I've been working with the orchestra to arrange Randy's classical piece. It's going to be part of my next album. Thank you for helping me understand that honoring someone's memory means celebrating their dreams, not just mourning their loss. The music lives on. Ozzy. That demo tape became part of No More Tears, the 1991 album that many consider Ozzy's masterpiece. Randy's classical influences wove through the entire record, finally given the sophisticated treatment he'd always envisioned. And every time Francis heard those orchestral arrangements, he remembered a night in Moscow when confession became catharsis, when guilt transformed into artistic purpose. The experience changed how Francis approached his role in Scorpions as well. He became even more protective of the band's creative space, more insistent that good ideas be given room to develop rather than being dismissed for commercial considerations. When Klaus brought him early versions of songs that would become their most meaningful work, Francis remembered Ozzy's regret and made sure every musical instinct was explored fully. Years later, when Francis made his own difficult decision to leave Scorpions in 1992, he thought about that conversation with Ozzy. The choice to prioritize family over fame, artistic integrity over commercial success, it was informed partly by understanding how much musicians could regret the opportunities they didn't take, the support they didn't give, the creative risks they didn't encourage. That night in Moscow, beneath the Russian stars, two musicians had shared a moment of profound human connection that transcended their different musical styles and career paths. Ozzy had found a way to transform 7 years of guilt into artistic purpose. Francis had gained a deeper understanding of how precious and fragile creative collaboration could be, and Randy Rhoads, 7 years after his death, had finally received the classical recognition his genius deserved. The Moscow Music Peace Festival was remembered for bringing Western rock to Soviet audiences, for the political symbolism of music crossing Cold War boundaries. But for Francis Buchholz, it would always be the night he learned that sometimes the most important thing a musician can do is simply listen to their collaborators' dreams, to their own artistic instincts, and to the whispered confessions of guilt that can either destroy or inspire depending on how they're received.